Okay, terrific. Yelling, thank you very much for your presentation. Now I would like to share a few remarks and address some questions. We already have received the three questions that you can simultaneously look at them. I First I would like to make some common questions. Primarily, I have three questions. First is that today the focus of your presentation is on the China side. The U.S.-China dilemma has been caused by the obviously misperception and uncertainty. According to your today's presentation, has been caused by some unique Chinese political economic system, and which has caused China's unique economic security growth model and the lack of balance between credible threat and credible assurance. Having said that, if you are asked about what is uncertainty coming from the U.S. side, that is not the primary focus of your presentation today, but if you ask some question about what is the problem of the U.S. side, I would like to listen to your answer. The second question is that you're suggesting the relevant third party players, including Japan, I believe to be more proactive to just avoid the fallout of the U.S.-China dilemma. China-U.S. dilemma will continue to remain, and you have to continue to make best effort to avoid that, to protect ourselves. But in order for the third party, including Japan, to protect ourselves from the fallout, we have to have the kind of a tremendous amount of political clout. In order for us to gain the political clout, we have to align ourselves with like-minded country. But as argued correctly, we have some diversification of our interest depending on like according to the two elements. One is that relationship with U.S. and China in economic terms. And also another element is in the relationship with the U.S. in the kind of security term. So in spite of that, some diversification of interest amongst kind of potentially like-minded countries, still we have to align ourselves with these potentially like-minded countries. So which is a challenge to me. Any suggestion? This is my second question. The third question is, of course, that today you highlighted on the kind of the uncertainty or misperception as a cause of a kind of vicious cycle of a dilemma. However, it seemed to me personally that there is another important source of the dilemma between these two countries, which is not just a misperception or fundamental conflict of interest between these two countries, big powers. U.S. wants to maintain its hegemony, and China wants to revise this geopolitical status quo, which is real, not the misperception. This seems to contribute to the kind of vicious cycle, which is a kind of cause of a dilemma. So even though we just give some solution to misperception, still the kind of this fundamental conflict of interest remain. So it seems to me that it's quite difficult to totally wipe out the kind of source of the dilemma. So if you have any view about that point, I would like to listen to that. These three questions are from me. Anyway, we have already received so far 4 questions. Do you want to answer to my question, or do you want to look at have you already looked at these 4 questions as well, or?
Why don't I respond to these 3 questions and then try to quickly address the questions in the chat.
Okay, as you like.
Yes. Okay, so very important questions. Thank you so much. This is very useful. So Absolutely. This is it takes two hands to clap, right? So there wouldn't be a dilemma if there wasn't misperception and uncertainty also from China reacting to US actions. What are some examples of this, right? So if we think about the current moment, right, there is a lot of uncertainty over what the Trump administration's intent at the end of the day is with China, right? Is balanced trade the only thing, or are there national security concerns as well? If we look within the Trump administration, there are a lot of China hawks, but they are hawkish in different ways. Which China hawk has influence within the Oval Office at this moment, right? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty and misperception opportunities and risks here at the moment in terms of the long term. What is it that the US wants with China? But even if we think about the previous Biden administration, with the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's small yard, high fence approach to export controls, right? I think that is a classic case of each side, the US wanting to convey something and it being perceived by China as something else, right? So from the American perspective, when it used the term small yard, high fence, what America was trying to signal is we are trying to be as restrained as we possibly can in terms of not imposing a security and export control logic on the rest of the US-China relationship. So they were trying to create a safe space for the rest of the relationship outside of these critical technologies. What China perceived was a surgical effort to target the most critical leading edge technologies that will be vital to China's future development, both economically and militarily, right? So what one side tried to say was restraint, the other side saw as surgical offense. But we also see across the two different administrations, different likelihoods of escalation. So with the Biden administration, I think there was a lot more effort to reach out and engage in economic diplomacy to explain the logic behind different actions. And so I think it did have some effect in terms of reducing misperception and unintended escalation on China's part, right? Because from Janet Yellen to Gina Raimondo, there was a lot more effort to within the Biden cabinet to communicate. And I think that's really important for reducing misperception. So I think it varies over different points of the US side, depending on which administration is in place. But there are examples of misperception across both. The second question on third parties needing to be more proactive, I absolutely agree. This is part of the problem here in that in order to get that critical mass for political clout and leverage, we need collective action, right? To search for the like-minded partners. But collective action is proving extremely difficult, right? Because each country has its own complicated national interest with both the US and China. And the incentives don't necessarily line up as easily as it might seem at first glance. So we need more leadership amongst these middle powers, you might call it, or third countries, to solve what is essentially a collective action problem, right? And I think a lot more work needs to be done in this arena amongst scholars, analysts, think tanks to put out options, right? What might some options be that might alleviate the collective action problem? Is it, for example, should we establish an eminent group of senior thinkers amongst a small group of third countries that can provide dispassionate policy options of alignment, right? Could we have a small group of senior thinkers to lay out options for reducing misperception such that we are in a world that is more stable? Because my concern now is that we are very aware of economic security vulnerabilities, but the individual actions of each government is generating a more insecure world. So how do we address the new sources of insecurity? We need collective action to think through the governance of this new geoeconomic world. So that is a real, I think, really important space for concerted, serious, substantive reflection and thinking here. There's absolutely a gap that is being highlighted. Thirdly, on this very important point that there is still very fundamentally a structural difference between the US and China that is driving insecurity between the two major powers. That is absolutely true, right? So that might be the argument that instead of a security dilemma, we're in a Thucydides trap. The reason I think the security dilemma dynamics are important to be aware of is the premise that in spite of these structural differences, I do believe neither great power wishes to enter into conflict, into military conflict that will be very costly for both sides. So given that assumption, there is a dilemma that emerges because we see the action counter-reaction, that escalation, nevertheless drives both great powers towards a greater likelihood of conflict. So there's that dilemma. I think the two can coexist. But my fundamental assumption is that neither wants to go into conflict, and yet they find themselves in a greater likelihood of conflict. So those are my responses to the first three questions.
Okay,
should I selectively look at a few, or which ones would you
right. Actually, we have so far received 5 questions, but it seems to me that at least, for instance, question 2, 3, 4, these three questions are more or less similar. The question concerned about the kind of Chinese, rather kind of industrial hegemony. It refers to some specific industries such as AI, autonomous driving, and also the robotics. And I guess that the question asks your personal kind of prospect of the kind of future of the Chinese hegemony on this specific sector, and what can the advanced economy do to address the challenge by China in this sector. This seems to be the concern, the question 2, 3, 4. And question 1 and the question 5 seem to be, in a sense, similar in that traditionally there are some countries, I guess, including Japan, who has been working engaged in both China and the US. What kind of line we are forced to take, and also similar question is also from the question 5, which is within this China's the new growth model, what could be the risk that Japan should be kind of braced for, something like that.
Absolutely. Okay, so on this question of industrial policy and potential hegemony in global markets, I think it depends on, there's one set of considerations for advanced economies and another set of considerations for what we might call global south, developing economies, emerging economies. For the latter group, I think that China, it's likely for China to make very substantial advances in these very important markets. And the reason I say this is that for almost a decade now, China has maintained a very proactive economic trade and investment stance, right? Especially in Southeast Asia, but also in other Belt and Road countries that falls under its Belt and Road ambit. When we look at what the U.S. has brought to the picture, the U.S. is in a very different domestic political economy situation, right? Regardless of whether we're talking about the Trump administration or the Biden administration, there's very little appetite for constructing any positive trade and investment framework right? There has been very little external liberalization efforts coming from the United States, regardless of which administration is in charge. So the US has been in a situation where it brings very little to the table. And China is there bringing a lot to the table, right? Of course, there are risks, and depending on which country you're talking about, they will have a different approach to trying to balance between taking advantage of that economic engagement while maintaining their national security or national interests. But China just brings more to the table, right? The U.S. domestic political economy situation is not able to balance, right? So that's where the situation I see in many of the countries that we might call that fall into the global south bucket. When it comes to advanced economies, I think there's a very big difference between US and Europe, right? Europe still maintains, it has a very strong legal framework that governs its trade and investment regime. You can see this in the way that the US has approached tariffs in a very different way from how Europe has approached tariffs, right? Europe sticks to its own methodology. Europe does seem to be still more open to investment. So for different countries in Europe, I do wonder if there is a very fine line that can be threaded for investment to be brought in from China, but on Europe's own terms, right? Is it possible for European governments to set out regulatory, licensing, IP, and standards regimes that allow Europe to bring in the best of that technology, but on its own terms that resolve real national security concerns? And that might actually not lead to hegemony in domestic markets in Europe, but a more balanced joint venture approach that brings benefits to both sides, right? I'm an optimist. I think that more work still needs to be done in this area, because otherwise European economies are depriving themselves of critical technologies that can resolve a lot of very real, very serious, very urgent public policy challenges, right, including in climate change. And if a country wants to be a big player in AI, it needs to resolve an energy problem and a pricing problem for electricity, right? And Chinese technology does in some way provide options for that energy and electricity challenge. So I think that a lot more work needs to be done to think about whether or not a more balanced market approach can be struck within these advanced economies. I think the political situation is very difficult, but I remain optimistic, and I'm very open to hearing advice or options or criticisms, ideas from many people in the audience who, are also thinking about these questions. On question 1 and question 5, in terms of risks and options for third countries, in particular for Japan, I think that it is there are very few realistic options, right? When there is a pressure coming from an important military security partner, and where I think Japan has already been very sophisticated in its approach to try to respond to the needs and demands of the US, to respond to the very real geographical relationship with China, right? It's geographical neighbors, right? You can't erase that fact. Deep economic ties, you can't erase that fact, right? So I think what Japan has managed to do well is to respond to the US's security interests, maybe economic interests as well, in a way that does not lead to unnecessary escalation, right? By insisting on multilateralism, the existing rule of law, and existing international law. I think trying to engage in economic policy that does not lead to unnecessary escalation is the important point for many third countries. And unnecessary escalation is what would drive that security dynamic proliferating right beyond the US and China. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. At least maybe I should take it that your suggestion is that the third country like Japan should work together with other like-minded countries.
Yes, yeah. So even diversification even within strengthening ties with Canada, Australia, the UK, and so on.
And your home country, the Singapore as well.
And Singapore, yeah.
Oh, well, okay. Thank you very much, Yelin. Okay, it's now time to close this seminar. Today's seminar's summary and the Yelin's material actually will be posted on the Rieti's website at the later date. And as you have seen on the last page of her slide, there is a reference to the email address as well. So as she said, any of the audience who have a willingness to pose a further question and the comment on her presentation and materials, please do so by sending email to her, the email address directly. Thank you very much for your participation in our BBL seminar today. This concludes today's seminar. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Yelin.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my ongoing research. Thank you very much. I'm very appreciative.
Okay, thank you very much. This concludes today's seminar.